coming up here.
And our word for today on this Wednesday, on the 29th week in Ordinary Time, this Wednesday, October the 23rd, our word for today is least, and here to talk about it is Deacon Dan Brahier. Good morning, Deacon Dan.
Good morning, Dave. Good morning, Ron. How are you this morning?
Doing great. How are you?
Fantastic. Still kind of glowing from yesterday's celebration of the 10th anniversary of Bishop Thomas. Beautiful Mass at the Cathedral. So it was just a great day.
At which you were the deacon.
I was, yes. Yes, I was honored to do that. So it was just a wonderful day.
Mm-hmm.
Today, our word of the day is least. And one of the thoughts that came to my mind, I was thinking back to when I was teaching as a teacher, educator, full-time at the university. I was often called upon to do these, teacher professional development workshops where I'd spend a day or a two or a week or whatever with a group of teachers. And the stipend that I would be paid, the fee, was variable. It depended on the audience size, how long I was going to be with them, how far I had to travel, all that kind of things. But the one thing that I realized is that the ones that I tended to enjoy a lot were the workshops or classes that I taught for free. Kind of those situations where you say, hey, I'm just going to go out and do this for this group of people. And the fact is, one of the things that I've learned, I've talked to performers about this as well, is that when somebody pays you a lot of money to do something, the pressure is really on to perform and impress, But if you're not being paid, the pressure is gone. The expectations are low, and it just feels different, So there's something to be said for just doing something because you want to do it, And in today's gospel, Jesus is concluding this talk with his disciples by using what's become a really familiar phrase in our world, to whom much is given, much is expected. Whereas Jesus says it in the gospel, his exact words are, much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still much more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more. So he's not talking about teaching classes, and he's not talking about presenting workshops, but he's really getting at the same idea, that if we've been paid heavily with God's grace, then we can expect that more will be demanded of us. And so Jesus presents that parable of the man who he knew his master's will, but despite knowing what the master wanted him to do, he simply acted otherwise. And God's given us these gifts, these talents, as you mentioned earlier, Dave, just the Holy Spirit himself in us. He expects us to use all of that according to his will. And he's going to set the bar high for us, expecting a lot from us. And so in that first reading today, where we encounter this word of the day, St. Paul acknowledges that. He says, to me, the very least of the holy ones, this grace was given. So Paul, he indeed was among the least. I mean, he was the one that was dragging Christians out of their homes. He was having them put in prison for their faith. But God converts him. He gives him that grace. And so now that he has that grace, Paul recognizes that more is expected him because more has been given to him. Now, we shouldn't surprise us. Remember how Jesus, back in Matthew chapter 5, he makes that statement that a lamp should not be hidden under a basket, but instead put on a lampstand so it lights up the entire house. So Paul may have been the least, but God has put him to use to preach the gospel, to be that light to the world and to follow God's will. And in Matthew chapter 25, of course, the most famous of all, when Jesus tells his disciples that what they do for the least, they did for him. And by the least there, he's talking about anybody in need, whether they're hungry, thirsty, poor, sick, and certainly the unborn. So many of us consider ourselves the least. I think we live in a world where that's true. We have a lot of us that have a low level of self-confidence or self-esteem, or we just simply feel like we're not worthy of God's grace. We're not worthy of carrying out his mission. And I think we have to step back and recognize that the truth is none of us are worthy. There's no doubt about that. But the Holy Spirit gives us the strength to put those gifts and talents to use through our attitudes, through what we say, and what we do with other people. So if God could take somebody as bitter and as angry as Paul was, in all of the fighting he was doing against the growth of the church, and make a saint of him, showering him with gifts, then think of what he can do for you and me, even if we think of ourselves as being one of those least in the kingdom, as Paul did. So I would encourage our listeners today to just think a little bit about the graces that God has given you, and to remember that with those gifts, God is going to expect much of you. And the question always comes down to, how are we going to put them to use to build his kingdom?
I love it, Deacon Dan. It's always this balancing act, right? We least, obviously, when we compare ourselves to Christ, but the value that we have is amazing given the fact that Jesus thought enough of us to lay down his life for us.
That's exactly right. I mean, we're all the least in the kingdom. If you start using the bar as God himself, of course we're the least. But he's called us through his grace to greater things to help us spread that gospel message.
Mm-hmm. Wow, good stuff. Thank you, Deacon. Have a great day.
Hey, tell whoever proclaimed the gospel at that Mass yesterday, they did a great job.
Yes, they did.
I mean, that was amazing.
And the intentions were good, too.